I'm Julia Davis, a film major who stumbled into the business world with no experience in 2006. I was able to fail enough to learn how to run a seven-figure business and have provided consulting services to over 200 individually owned companies. Through this podcast, I hope to provide some perspective on the growth and grit it takes to accomplish big goals and share some hard lessons I've had to learn along the way. Today on the podcast, we've got Trevor Oldham, who actually helps operate a company about podcasting, which is really exciting, but comes from the business world and has built and developed business and leadership development and things like that. So we're going to hit on some of those topics today with him, just kind of covering all aspects. So can you give the listeners on here just a little bit of a background on yourself, like how you got started in the business world and maybe what you did before that?
Yeah, most certainly. So I would say really the story starts probably sometime in high school. And I mean, I could talk for hours on going through the whole journey, but in a nutshell, I always wanted to start my own business. I was mowing people's lawns, I was buying and selling baseball cards, always trying to generate money on my own. And I think I was a senior in high school, and I read this book, and it was basically the differences between the upper class and the middle and lower class. And one of the main differences was that folks in the upper class had gone off and started their business. And typically those in the middle class were working for an employer. Not to say that you can't make good money working for an employer or that you're going to be wealthy running your own business, but that sort of ingrained in my concept the topic of entrepreneurship. And I never knew that it was a name. I always thought I would just go out, I'd start my own business and I would just do that, never realizing it was actually called something on the back end. So first things first, I started importing phone cases from China, and I would buy these phone cases. I believe it was 20 to 30 phone cases for 50 bucks. Tried to flip them on eBay for 5 to 10 bucks a piece. They're all knockoffs, so that didn't work out too quickly. I think I just gave them away to friends and family. That gravitated towards starting a bracelet and watch company. I was importing these products from China, and I would buy the bracelets for a buck, sell them for 10, buy the watches for 2, sell them for 20, and I built up almost like a brand on Instagram. That was the primary way that I was selling them. But I enjoyed that company, but it wasn't like a passion project or anything like that. And then that led me to starting a different company with a partner where it was more of a motivational based company. I was in college at the time and I felt as though there wasn't a ton of college students that were into personal development, that weren't into entrepreneurship. So, and what I mean by a motivational based company is I'm sure you've seen motivational like Instagram quotes online. We basically did that, but turbocharged it, and we grew to like 100,000 Instagram followers within like 6 months. It was super easy. We're getting tens of thousands of likes per post. And it was through that process that I had gone off and started a podcast for the company. And that was back in 2015. So I was back in the podcasting space, what is that, 9, 10 years ago? At this point, a very long time ago before podcasting was really popular. And I was bootstrapping the company. So I was doing everything on my own. I was booking the guests, I was editing the show, I was doing the social media, the whole nine yards when it comes to podcasting. After about 2 years of doing that, just wasn't working out with the partnership, wasn't working out with the business, and happened to get into that a little bit further. But then I just started freelancing out what I had learned. And through freelancing, that eventually led me to start my company, which I now run, Podcasting You. But I mean, I really launched the company and freelancing, aspect of it back in 2017. So been in business coming up or over 8 years now at this point. And I started that company as a junior in college, never really expecting it to be as big as it was. And the company, I continued to generate profits and generate more clients and kind of just kept rolling with it after all these years. And it's sort of just, grown over time. And but again, happy to go into it further, but just in a nutshell, that's sort of what that trajectory looks like. Whereas like starting out with those phone cases and the bracelets and this other company, and then eventually in the podcasting company where, yeah, I'd been doing it 5 or 6 years before I really found a business that was generating some money.
Yeah, so I want to rewind a little bit to something that you said, which was that the company that you worked with the motivational quotes and supercharging them and creating a lot of traction. What can you explain that more? Like what that sounds really interesting. Like what was that?
Yeah, so we would post motivational quotes like "lines not cheap" or just something along those lines, and then we would write a nice caption for it, and we would be posting 4 times a day. I believe we were doing 8 a.m., 12 p.m., 4 p.m., and 8 p.m. So around the clock throughout the day. And then it was interesting. So there was these almost sites where once you get to a certain amount of followers on Instagram, there's like these inner circles on the back end, at least at the time when I was running it. And I would promote this client, I would promote this person for, however X many hours, and they would promote our Instagram on the back end. And then eventually, once you grow to like 25, 50K followers, companies would want to pay us almost like brand sponsorship. So we would do that. And honestly, it was fairly easy to grow once you sort of crack the Instagram algorithm at the time. But the problem is people love to like, share, comment on these posts. But when it comes to buying a course, when it comes to buying an ebook, that's sorta it's a little bit more difficult. Like, we tried to do a clothing line through the company, and it just wasn't selling as well. But when it comes to people just love that motivational content, these motivational quotes, maybe we might pull someone from a professional business person like Jim Rohn, or a professional athlete like, say, Conor McGregor or Tom Brady, these different athletes that are out there, and people love them. But again, it was a little bit harder to try to sell a product to that audience, and it was a real grind, honestly. At the end of the day, I was putting in probably 40, 50 hours a week into this company. And I was still in college at that time. Believe I was a sophomore in college when I had started this company. So I had that on top of the course load. And then, I mean, when you run a company for 2 years and you're in the negative for those 2 years, you're putting in so many hours.
That's motivating. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little, it's harder to keep pushing forward with it.
Yeah. So you had kind of that entrepreneurial itch, but you've obviously had some mentorship and people you've worked with along the way and probably seen all types of leadership, right? You've seen really great leadership and you've seen really horrible leadership. What do you notice that like great leaders have in common? And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, what do you notice that is really negative leadership? If someone recognizes this, they should probably like find another job.
Yeah, I would say the biggest aspect of being the leader and seeing the leadership is just almost like doing anything in the company. What I mean by that is, as I've grown these companies, even today as I'm running my podcasting company, sometimes I might have to step in and help out my team where it might be more of I say like a minimum wage task. So something that's not worth a lot to my time, but I'm going to step in and help them out. And just because I'm the CEO and the founder of the company doesn't mean that this work's going to be below me, especially when I hire someone new and they need that help. I need to walk them through that. Yeah, I could tell you the ins and outs of the podcasting space. I'm doing it for 10 years, but if someone's only been in the space for a year, or let's say not even a year, say a couple of weeks, and they have no idea, just hand holding them, leading by example, owning up to it if something goes wrong, protecting my employees, that's been a big one. Especially when we're dealing with clients where 99% of clients, they're great to work with, they're easy to work with. I enjoy working with them, but then you always get that 1% where they're a nightmare, they're yelling at our team, they could be swearing at our team. And again, the goal is not to do that, but sometimes a client just gets set off, and that's going to happen when you've been in business long enough. You're going to deal with clients that are enjoyable to deal with. So then I have to stand up in front of them and protect my client, or protect my employee, whether that's firing the client or whatever that may be, sticking up for them. And that's always not the easiest to do, especially when you're someone like me that's a little bit more laid back. Now I have to hop on a call with a client that's yelling at us just to protect my team. So always just making sure that they're taken care of in that sense. And I'd say what I see from a bad leader is you're telling your company to do something and then you're doing something entirely different. As an example, in my company, I'd be telling them, okay, we want to pitch a client a certain way, and then I pitch a client an entirely different way just because it's easier. Because there's easy ways to pitch a client. It's just sending out a cookie cutter pitch to every single host that's out there. But the hard way is making it specific for that specific podcast host, and it's just going to take more time. So if I tell my team to do something, then I step in to help out with a client and do something completely different, that's not really going to be a sign of a good leader. Or if they come to me and tell me, hey, I'm having a problem with this client, and I'm like, oh, who cares? Like, just deal with it type of deal. That's not necessarily what the team wants to hear, and sort of evolves over time because, like, I never really knew how to lead people or how to run a company or even how to manage people, fire people, everything that comes with it, especially when you're in college. Those aren't, I mean, you can read textbooks and take courses, but when it comes to managing the real world aspects of it, it's definitely something that's not that easy.
Yeah, definitely. And your expertise at this point, or what you've had a lot of experience in, is on the podcasting side of being able to help people formulate great guests and do all of that. Um, in the company that I work with a lot of different businesses and a lot of them want to start podcasts or they're like, "Hey, I'd love to be able to do that." Do you have any quick tips or like what are a few tips that you might give them to say, "Hey, this is what you really want to make sure you do when you do start that?"
So I would say first and foremost, just make sure you're going to be in it for the long haul. It can really take anywhere from a year or two for you to really start to see results in your podcast. I would say making sure that you have a backlog of episodes. And what I mean by that is that when you're launching your podcast, you have anywhere from 5 to 10 episodes pre-recorded, ready to go out, because there's going to be times in your life where it's just a busy week and you're not going to have time to sit down and record a podcast episode. What happens is too many podcasts, they start a podcast and they have an episode go out, say, on Monday, then the following Monday, then the following Monday, then something comes up. They get busy for 2 Mondays in a row. They don't have the podcast episodes to go out, and then they lose interest. And then that's going to be the end of the show. And there's a stat out there where it's about 90% of podcasts don't make it past the 10th episode, which is a pretty crazy stat. So people get really excited about starting a podcast, think it's a really cool opportunity, really cool thing to do, but there's a ton of work that goes into it. I would say make sure that you have a plan in place for your podcast where, yes, it's nice to start a podcast, but how are you going to be promoting it? Are you going to be promoting it on social media? Are you going to be sending it to your newsletter? Is it going to be with guests? Is it going to be solo episodes, and planning a content calendar, planning how you're going to be editing these? And it's really a big work in the beginning. That way you can make sure that you have it all ready to go for when that podcast goes live. And then really the last big piece of advice I would give would to be pick a niche and stick within that niche. Or if you make it general, depending on what you're looking to do. And the way you have to think about it is there's so many podcasts out there. There's over 2 million podcasts out there. What's going to make your podcast different compared to the next podcast? Let's say if I'm running a business podcast show, what makes your business podcast show different than another one? Maybe you specialize with a specific niche in business. Maybe you specialize in a specific topic. Maybe you do make it general, but you make it some sort of unique way that's on your own, that's going to get your listeners to keep coming back to your show. So I recommend any of those things, but really, honestly, the biggest thing would be just making sure you have those episodes ready to go, because so many people just start and then they just give up. And then two, just knowing like it's gonna take a long time. If you wanna get, like, a return on your investment, like, go spending money on Google Ads or Facebook ads. It's gonna come back to you a lot quicker, where podcast is way more rewarding, the more you nurture your audience, but it takes a long time to build up that audience. So just be aware of that, where unless you already have this massive following, it's gonna take a while for you to get your boots off the ground.
That's really good advice because I do think people are in it for, like, an immediate gratification. They're like, "I'm gonna do a podcast, hundreds of thousands of people are gonna listen to it." It's like, well, maybe not, maybe it might be your 50th episode that, like, really hits with people and it takes off. But I think people are so used to getting immediate instant gratification from things that I can see how a lot of people get discouraged very, very quickly, just like with anything else, people start and can't, don't wanna finish or don't wanna do. Um, so I definitely that stat does not surprise me at all that 90% kinda trail off and end up disappearing after the 10th episode. I can see how that would happen, how that's possible. You've worked with a lot of different clients. You've had the opportunity to work with some really high profile clients and some really, just run of the mill clients, I'm sure. How do you handle working with like a big client, or is there any protocol that you go through, or what do you do to make sure that you can maintain or retain a high profile client?
The way that I look at it is some clients are just, you just know at the end of the day that they're, I want to say, worth more to your business, but could be a little bit more important. So maybe we be a little bit more high touch with them. Maybe we send them a little bit more reporting. And the reason I say this is to give you an example. We worked with a client and he was a rich dad advisor. So I'm sure everyone's heard of the book Rich Dad, Poor Dad. So he wasn't, it would be nice if I could have gotten Robert Kiyosaki as a book, but he was a part of that company. And we knew working with him, like if we do a really good job, then we can name drop him when we're trying to get potential clients. Where if we're working with, let's say, a standard real estate investor that's been doing it for 20 years, but maybe they don't have as big of a presence in this particular individual. He had also written a book that sold 1 million copies, where we just want to make sure that we're doing a really good job with them and then stepping up to that pressure, because we know how valuable it can be to your business. Obviously, you want to do a great job for every single client that you have come into your business, but you do know sometimes there's those special clients that do come in where it's like, okay, like if we do a really good job with them, this can be a ton of referrals for our business. We can, again, name drop them, which makes it a lot easier on sales calls with the potential clients where they're asking, like, more often than not, people always ask, who have you worked with? So when we can share a big name like that, that would bring some recognition to our company, it definitely makes it helpful. But yeah, it's just making sure, really honestly just having all those systems and processes in place for every single client. So for us, it's just like sending monthly reports to the client. It's having a sort of stretch strategy on which podcasts we're going to be reaching out to them, how many podcasts we should be reaching out to them, depending on who they are. Because sometimes, depending on the niche that we work with, so if it's a standard, say, real estate investor, we know if we reach out to 10 podcasts, probably five of them are going to want to have our client onto. Where if we work with someone in real estate that does, let's say, insurance, it's just going to be a little bit more difficult, or a financial advisor. We know it's a highly competitive space. So maybe only we reach out to 10 podcasts, we only get them booked on one or two. So now we know, okay, if we want to get them booked on four, we just got to reach out to 10 for this real estate investor. We have to reach out to 20 for this financial advisor, just given that it's a more competitive space. And you learn that over time. That way I can set up our team for success. And it just, at least for me, again, it just comes with the business of knowing, okay, like this is the type of podcast we should be reaching out to. Here's who we shouldn't be reaching out to. Like if someone comes to us as a potential client, says, I want to get on the Joe Rogan podcast or something along those lines. And I say that because it happens to us about once a week on a sales call where someone asks if they can if we can get them on that podcast, where I don't want to be pulling my hair out trying to get them on that show, because odds are it's not going to happen. Not this, not, we've never gotten anyone on that podcast. I don't even know if it's worth pitching to, if you're just your standard, individual. I think you'd probably want to have someone that's pretty extraordinary on a show. But setting those expectations too up from the beginning to know, like, okay, like what podcast do you want to go on? And that's happened to us in the past where we've signed on a client expecting them to go on a typical podcast we book clients onto, and all of a sudden they have these really high expectations. And I'm not a miracle worker, obviously in the podcasting space, but there's a line, you know, where it comes to, like, okay, I only want to go on podcasts that have 1,000 reviews, or I only want to go on podcasts that are in the top 25 of the business category on iTunes, where that's very difficult. Not to say that it can't happen, but I know our expectation is our company, like, yeah, we could probably, reach out to the shows, where are we gonna, get you booked on the show. So just setting those expectations too upfront with that particular client. Again, more often than not, most clients are easy to work with, and we have a set sort of guideline of which podcasts we reach out to. But you never want to set up those expectations where you take on a client and then they have these sky high expectations, and then all of a sudden we're having to send out like 50 pitches just to
Right.
get them one booking. And the way you look at it, let's say each client's paying me $1,000 a month. I'm spending 20 hours on this client versus 2 hours on this client. Then the profit margins are all out of whack, and it's like not even worth having them as a client at some point.
Right, yeah. No, that makes total sense. And I know something that I didn't realize that I think is really interesting for people to know is those advisors on, that are working with books and things like that, a lot of times they have to pay to be a part of that, which I didn't realize. Like, if you're on the Rich Dad Poor Dad team, you pay to be a part of that team,
Oh wow. Yep.
which is, and maybe that's not the same for every company, but I know a lot of times in those industries, it's like you gotta, like, it's kinda like a membership, right? Like, you to have that branding next to your name, it's like a fee you have to do. The other thing thought was interesting is, have you found this with podcasts? If you have a guest or somebody that wants to go on, like, a high profile podcast, that guest actually, do they have to pay money to be on that podcast in some cases?
Yeah, so it definitely comes up in some cases. So we'll sometimes present it to our client, but I always tell them that there's enough podcasts out there. I don't recommend paying. And some of them, it makes sense when you look at the podcast. It has, I don't say 100,000 downloads an episode, and they're charging a 5K guest fee. You're like, okay, I can understand that. Sometimes you get these podcasts that have been out a month, and I don't want to say a month because we don't want to pitch clients to that, but let's say 6 months or a year, fairly newer. Maybe they have 10 reviews on iTunes, but it makes sense for what our client does. It's a specific niche, but you consider maybe a small, medium-sized show, and then they're charging 5K to be on it. And I'm just like, it doesn't make any sense. No one's gonna see an ROI on that. Where sometimes it does make sense if you look at a specific show. But honestly, like for me, like, and even me running this company, I don't think I'd ever want to pay to be on a podcast. I've seen some cool strategies out there with podcast hosts that they'll say, if you want to get interviewed within the next 2 weeks, you can pay a $50 fee. If you don't want to pay it, we'll interview you, 3 or 4 months out. Something along those lines where they're like, okay, like $50 fee, that's not that, that's not too bad. Maybe I'll do it. But once it starts to get into the thousands, I've seen, 10,000, 25,000 for these episodes. I'm like,
That's
I don't even
crazy.
know if it's worth it. And honestly, sometimes these bigger shows are more generalized. So it's like use even your target audience listening to these specific shows. So I wouldn't spend the money on it. If I were spending 5K, I'd rather spend it trying to get on like 20 podcasts or put the 5K into Google Ads. Something along the lines, just not putting all your eggs into one basket.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that makes total sense. So running your company, back to that topic, building a business, running your business and learning that, being kind of more of an introverted guy, how did you figure out how to kind of be more intense when you needed to be intense, but then you could dial it back a little bit? Like, what was that like?
Yeah, I think I was just learning from it over time. I think it was just not being taken advantage of in the company, which I think it's easy early on when you're hiring, you don't really necessarily know who to hire, and I think that's my best example, having employees that have I keep them on too long, and I know in my gut they're just not doing a good job, and you can tell when you come across these employees where, let's say I have 2 employees, they're each managing 5 clients, and one's doing 10 hours a week, and she's getting the clients booked on all the shows. Then I have this other one over here that's doing 25, 30 hours a week, and the similar clients, and now I'm spending 3 times as much on this one employee versus this other employee, but the clients are technically just as easy to get booked on shows, and then knowing, like, I think they're overinflating their hours or how much they're working for it, and I can tell because I do profitability numbers on all the clients, and we wanna stay above a certain threshold that make sure that it's profitable for us to keep the client on, and you start to know, like, okay, and then just taking too long to fire, we're realizing that's just not good for the business. I had employees that don't get back to me in a timely manner, and the next thing you know, I have a client coming to me wondering like, "Hey, like, I haven't heard from so and so," and then again in my gut knowing that I should have fired them earlier. So I think it just comes with that experience over time and running the business, and there's no really easy way to go about it. I think it's just having that experience of running it. Okay, like, here's when I should be, the business owner, because I try to be obviously friendly to all my employees, but sometimes you have to put on that business owner and be like, "Okay, hey, you're not responding to these emails. What's going on? Are you sick? Is there a family emergency?" Like, we have to get coverage for this. Like, sometimes I've had good employees where they take a vacation for 2 or 3 weeks and they don't let me know in advance. And I should preface it to say they're all 1099 contractors. So they're not like, they don't have paid vacation or anything like that. And they're all part time. And then at the end of the day, but I would like to know if you're going to be going on vacation for 3 weeks. Like, if it's our salesperson, I would like to know that to make sure either I or someone else from the company can come in and cover those sales calls. So just being firm with them and letting them know, like, hey, like, this is unacceptable. Like, let's just make sure that it doesn't happen again. And then if it does, having to fire them, that's obviously not the fun part of being a business owner. You hire everyone, you'd hope that you don't have to fire them. But I think it's just, that part of it. And then even showing up for sales calls. I mean, trying to do sales calls out of my dorm room, doing that in the college in the college library, being super uncomfortable with that. Eventually, I hired a salesperson to take them over just because I didn't enjoy that aspect of it that much. I think my problem is I always have a hard time asking for the sale. I just need to bring someone on that could come in and ask for it. Our company could be a perfect fit, but when it came to ask for the sale and to close the deal, I know is a little bit trickier for me. I'm not the natural salesperson in my family. I think they all went to my brother and my father, who are both salespeople, and then I'm more like my sister that's more introverted and laid back. But yeah, I think it just came with experience, continuing to push myself and just knowing, like, there's certain points and times where even I, as a business owner, when I have to push myself outside my comfort zone and to deal with whatever challenges come up.
Yeah, I think metrics are really important in that regard, right? Because when you use metrics or reporting, it makes it so much easier to have a conversation because it's not based on how you feel, it's based on factual data of like key points and relevant information versus just saying like, "Hey, this isn't working out," and having no data to back you up. So, I think that makes a lot of sense. Um, what was like the best as you were starting these businesses or, changing trajectory in your path, what was some of the best advice that you've ever been given?
So I'd say some of the best advice would be one, charging what you're worth in the business. So early on, we charged honestly, we were a pay-as-you-go service. And that was a terrible that was a terrible way to go about it, but that was just very early on in the business where I get you booked on a podcast, and then I would bill you once you recorded that podcast episode. But sometimes these podcast episodes might not be for a month or 2, 3 months out for when you get that booking link or the scheduling link to schedule that interview. So that was one aspect of it was don't do that. Make sure we always get paid upfront for the work we do. Sometimes you might have to refund the client, but that's few and far between. That's really the only negative downside of it. But I would take that over any part of the day. So that was a big aspect of it was charging what we're worth. And that really changed from I think early on we charged like $50 a podcast, $75 a podcast. So then we added on where you had to pay up for two upfront, and then eventually we just end up going to these high ticket packages where we would bill someone either 3K or 6K, somewhere along those lines. And that was great for this a standpoint of we found that we were getting better quality of clients coming in because if someone's paying us 3,000 or 6,000 to work with our company, they're going to be more experienced, especially where we found our niche ended up being in real estate, where some of these other niches we were working with, like let's say the health industry, not as many people could afford those services, where folks in the real estate space, they could afford it. And eventually we switched to a more recurring revenue model where we charge a client anywhere from, $800 a month to $1,600 a month or more, depending on how many service offerings they have. And that just makes it so much easier as a business where once we started charging what we were worth, the business just really took off. And I remember just being so excited when we signed on that first $3,000 client to come onto our business and then scaled the business from there. But the issue I found with that and why we're now a recurring revenue business, where sometimes in a month we might sign up 5 to 10 new clients and we have 30K in new revenue. And then the next month it's a little bit slower and we only sign up 1 to 2 clients. So I know it was always harder for me to manage the money aspect of it because you would have some months where, oh wow, we did 40K in revenue. Let's go off and spend a ton more on Google ads. Oh no, the next month we only signed up 1 new client. So it was always up and down. So I find like, okay, I can look at, I can do the projection models each and every month now to see how much we have coming in based on the recurring revenue. So that'd be an aspect of it, whether you go in your business, whether you charge a higher ticket item. I say higher ticket item, just a price point in the thousands, or you do that recurring model where I find that a little bit easier. And then the second best piece of advice I would probably get from my business coach that I had worked with was knowing when to fire clients. Because I would come to him with a problem with a client. Oh, this client is, they're driving me up a wall. They're yelling at me. And anytime that happens, I just refund them their full amount of their package and just be done with them. So, like, let's say, as an example, I signed a client on for 10 podcasts, get them booked on 10 podcasts for 3,000. I booked them on 3 shows where they're stressing me out. They're having all these demands. Like, I've had clients as an example, they've called me 4 or 5 times a week asking for updates on my personal phone at any point in time of the day, not just during normal business hours, which I guess that would be another piece of advice. I typically don't give my phone number out to clients for that's a very specific reason, unless they specifically ask for it. For something, I try to keep everything over email. But going back to the money aspect of it, yeah, like it stings and it sucks. And I'm down on myself for about a week, losing out on that $3,000. But it's so much better for the mental health to just refund them that money than to deal with them. Like I've had clients call me up on the phone like Christmas Eve, just yelling at me. And to give you an example of this story of like this particular client, he was hard to deal with. But he paid us, he kept renewing these packages. So it was almost like, okay, like you're gonna keep paying us, the $3,000 package every 2 or 3 months. It makes sense to keep working with you as much as I didn't enjoy working with them. And one day he called me up yelling at him because the podcast host wanted to have an intro call. And really the intro call was just like, hey, like, I just want to, chat real quick. I want to set up a date for the interview. I just want to figure out some topics. We can talk about something very simple. And he just like freaked out on me, like, you're not doing a good job presenting me. Like, I've never been asked this before. I've been on over 500 podcasts. I've never done an intro call. Like, and just reaming me out over the phone. I'm like, at the end of the day, this just isn't worth it. I'm just going to refund your money and be done with this relationship. No amount of money is worth it because, again, there's 99% of our clients, they're great to deal with. I enjoy talking to them. But again, you're going to get that 1% every now and then. That's not worth it. And just refund their money, be done with it. And what are they going to say to you? Yeah, like they might say something bad about your company. But at the end of the day, I gave you your full money back. I wasn't trying to shortchange you or anything. I just want to be done with it. Yeah, I lose out on my time. I lose out on how much I played my employees, but what I get is my is my peace of mind back, and that's well worth it.
And I think that a lot of business owners need to hear that message because even when you're working with employees, it's kind of the same thing. Every once in a while, you have people that are working for you that are not doing the job or are really miserable for everybody else to work with or just creating a huge problem in your business. And I think sometimes there's fear associated with if I let this person go, what's going to happen, right? Are they going to bash me or are they going to create a problem? When in reality, if you do right by the person and you're like, hey, I'll give you 2 weeks of full pay, but you can't work here anymore, right? Like, you don't give me a 2-week notice. I'm giving you 2 weeks of pay and I need you to leave my business and never come back. And you give them that and have them go, I think is just, it's so much better for everybody instead of just suffering through it. And then that person leaves and they're still mad, right? So it's just
Yep.
like getting, cause like they're going to be mad either way. It's just their personality. It's in their DNA. So I think if you just get ahead of it and say, you know what, this is not working. I'm going to give you money that so you don't have to look for a job for a few weeks or you can catch up or whatever it is, and then you can find something else to do. Even if they do say something negative, you have so much more credibility because you can say, "I paid this person 2 weeks of their pay to try to help them out, but it wasn't working out." And then, you know, you feel good about what you did regardless of whatever they do.
Yep, exactly.
So I think that's a really, really valid key point for sure. I'm gonna pivot a little bit because I read something in your bio that was really intriguing to me where it said you paid off $90,000 in student loans in 1 year.
Yep, that's correct.
So how did you do it?
Yeah, so it intertwines good with our story. So this was so I graduated college, and I knew I'd taken out some student loans. Wasn't really sure how much in student loans I'd been taking out. I probably should have realized it beforehand. Ended up going on, not even knowing my account information. Just was, and I thought I was doing a good job. I lived in Massachusetts, so I went to Massachusetts state schools. I ended up transferring halfway through, but wasn't going to like private education, just Massachusetts state schools. I was living on campus, didn't think anything really of it, and then eventually went online and saw all my loans and then totaled up to be about 90,000. And there were all different types of loans. Average interest rate was like 7 to 8%. Luckily, I was able to first step was refinancing those, and I forget the name of the company. I don't know if it was Credible or I don't think it was, but nonetheless, I ended up refinancing them down to about it's been a while now, but refinanced them down to 3%. So that was the first big aspect of it was lowering that interest rate. And I think I had about 11,000 in savings from college. I took 10,000 of it. I threw it on the loans. So at that point I owed about 80,000 on these student loans. And then what I did is after I graduated from college, I ended up working a W-2 job for a little while. And in that W-2 job is I had an apartment with my girlfriend at the time, now wife, and I wasn't saving up for a 401k, and I was just putting everything I owned on it. I would get about a $2,500 bonus quarterly from that job and would put that on it. So that, helped me pay off from that job. I probably saved 30 or 40,000 just from that job, not, living very frugal and just taking that money, throwing that on my student loans, not really doing anything extra. I remember I got like it was the COVID check or something along those lines. It was like 1,400 bucks, took that, just threw that right on my student loans, like any extra money, didn't invest anything. Looking back, maybe I should have done like the 401k match, but nonetheless, I was just throwing everything on it. So that knocked off, and I had about 50K in student loans left. And then that goes back to the my story in my podcasting business back in 2020, where I switched to this high ticket model, where now I have clients paying me 3,000 and 6,000, and I would take like 75% of that and would take that money and throw it right onto my student loans. And that's how I was able to pay it off so quickly is through the business. But there's two learning points there. One is I learned the power of I should be an S corp and not a sole proprietor, more for tax purposes. So that was an enjoyable tax experience because when I took off, I paid about I think 65,000 from the business to pay off the remainder, or 55,000 to pay off these loans. I didn't pay any taxes on that. So when it became tax time in that April, I think I owed another 14,000 in taxes that I had to pay. So then that's where I realized I'm going to be an S corp. So that way, like right now, I'm an employee of my business. So anytime I pay myself, I get federal taxes and state taxes, Medicare, Social Security, whatnot taken out. So that way I don't have to worry about it. And there's other tax benefits. But yeah, that was it's like I paid off all these student loans. It's like, okay, here's a nice another five-figure bill that I
Yeah.
have to worry about paying, and this one's from the government, which I know I definitely have to pay. So I ended up paying, paying that off as well. So even more money. But yeah, it was just that was really the big key was just, taking the 10,000 I had in savings, using the money I had coming in from my W-2, which it was probably 25 to 35,000, and just living super frugal. And it's interesting because now I have that same sort of mentality where outside of my mortgage that we have between my wife and I, just taking everything I have and now I look at to invest it so I don't have to be running this business forever. That way I can, I invest in real estate and different things like that. But yeah, that was the big aspect. And it's interesting is people will take years to pay off their student loans. And for me, I was like, I just didn't want that debt burden. I think my monthly payment when I first started was like 1,500 a month and then ended up going up to 2,500. And then I was just throwing as much money as I could onto it. And the company that I'd use, I could go on and I could pay daily, which was nice. So I would know like, okay, here's exactly how much the student loans are going down. But yeah, no, looking back, it was definitely not an enjoyable process. I don't wanna have to do it. I don't wanna have to do it again. I definitely learned a lot from it. Looking back now, it'd be nice to have that whatever. I mean, if you throw in the IRS debt there too on 105K back, but, I was glad that I went through, I paid it off and I got it done with, and then now I sort of took that mentality and then now I just use it, on the opposite end for investing. So it ended up working out in the end.
Yeah, for sure. And how many clients does your company currently have?
Yeah, I think right now we probably have about 20 to 25 clients we work with.
Nice. And so you've been an entrepreneur almost your whole life, right? From selling the pens and from China or whatever way back in the day. So if you had to kind of say like the entrepreneurial journey is for somebody who likes this, but it's not for somebody who wants this. How would you fill out that sentence?
So I would say if you're someone that wants to have an uncapped income, that wants to generate money on your own, that's going to be for you. I mean, when I'm on IW2, no matter how good of a job I would do, I, yeah, I would get my bonus, but it wasn't like I would get more than my bonus, whatever quarterly goals the company had set for me. Even if I go above and beyond for them, it doesn't really matter. I'm not going to get paid more by the company. So I know that being an entrepreneur, I have an uncapped commission, honestly, at the end of the day. But with that, if you're someone that can't deal with the up and downs within a business, maybe entrepreneurship isn't going to be for you because there's going to be swings all the time. And as an example, in my business, even this past year, so we primarily work with real estate investors. Within the real estate market within itself, not a lot of people are buying properties because interest rates have been so high. There's not a lot of properties that make sense to buy. So when people aren't buying properties, they're not raising capital for these real estate deals. Well, our clients more often than not work with us to help market themselves so that they can raise this capital. So I think it was like in the month of June was our hardest month where we lost like 40% of the business. I'm like literally within 3 days of all these clients coming in and pausing their packages that they're working with us. And then we had to build that back up over the next couple of months. But if you're not someone that can stomach that, it's really not going to be for you. And even for me, I mean, that's hard when you wake up every day and there's a new client saying, "Hey, I want to cancel or I want to pause my package. I'm just not finding any real estate deals. It doesn't make sense for me to market myself right now." So that's really my advice would be if you want to have unlimited income, then it makes sense to be an entrepreneur. But at the end of the day, you have to remember that it's going to be very difficult when you have these up and downs. There's going to be, good times, but there's also going to be those low lows where sometimes it's better just being that W-2 employee where you just have a steady income and you can go home at the end of the day and you don't necessarily have to think about the business at all.
Yeah, you can just turn your phone off and not have to field problems at 11 p.m. or
Yeah.
whatever time they arise. Did your when you were in college and you were doing this in the library or whatever, did your friends think you were just absolutely nuts?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it was like more reverse where I would get up at like 3 a.m. and start working. So I was more like get up and then I would just I would go to bed at like I don't know, like 8:30 and get up at 3 a.m. and just start working, and I was all about it. I was the president of the entrepreneurship club at the college I had gone to and president of the marketing club as well. And yeah, I was just all about it. I remember just like sharing all these like Jim Rome quotes with different people, sharing all these podcasts and books. And yeah, I might have been a little bit over the top. I think I've come back a little bit in a good sense where I've, not so, you know, I don't know about pushing on people, but understanding, like, in my mindset, I was like, "Oh, like, if you're not an entrepreneur, like, what's wrong with you?" So my mindset is definitely shifted. You can see that was more that motivational based company where that came from, so many years
Yeah.
ago.
When you read so many of those quotes, you start to, just
Yeah,
like
yeah, exactly.
get into the one track mind for sure. So any other tips or tricks for people, that are on their journey building businesses, going through that roller coaster of, good months, bad months, having to hire, fire people? I think a lot of times people really get in their head, right? Where they start to question, like, can I actually do this? Am I somebody that's going to be able to come out of this and be okay? What advice would you have for those people that are, kind of overthinking or just overanalyzing in their brain to try to snap out of it and realize, like, hey, anybody can do this. It just takes these elements.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it's twofold. And the way I look at it is back in say June, my business, taking a 40% hit. I know and understand that it's not going to be forever. And that's what you have to understand is that even if you are in this low point in your business, that it's not going to be forever. And with that said, it's just really taking that consistent action. I say every single day. So for me, and now I just take Saturday and Sunday off with my wife and my daughter, where I don't want to be working when they're around and they have the time off. I know that was the perks of having my daughter, where I went from working these 12, 14-hour days where now I'm more confined to these, 8 to 9 hour days that I work in outside the occasional work that might come up. But really just taking that consistent action and knowing like, okay, over time, maybe not a month from now, maybe a few months from now, I'm gonna pull myself back up where yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I wanted to recoup that 40% of revenue lost within a day the next day, but it took 3 or 4 months to get back up to where we were and then continue to grow it from there. So just knowing that it takes time and then just taking that consistent action day in, day out. I find that really honestly, that quiets my mind is whenever I have any doubts in my business, if I just sit down and get to work, then I don't really think about any of those negative thoughts because I know I'm taking the action and eventually that action is gonna lead to those good results.
Yeah, that's good advice. Just make your I would tell the guys that were going door to door doing whatever, like, make your feet work faster than your brain, right? Like,
Mhm.
if you can always get your hands or your feet working faster than your mind, then you're in good shape. But if your mind starts to work harder than your feet and hands, then you're in trouble because your brain will tell you all the kinds of crazy stuff that maybe it shouldn't be.
Mhm.
'Cause you're going through stuff. So if people wanna find you, if they're listening to this and they're like, "Man, I could really use some support in getting myself on podcasts," or, because that's the premise of your business is gaining clients that are like, I need more exposure as a business." If they're in real estate or, they're in other industries and they just want more exposure personally to build their own personal brand, how can they find you? And what can you offer them?
Yeah, most certainly. So they can go to podcastingyou.com. That's podcastingyou.com. And you can book a discovery call with the company. And really, it's just a roadmap. Like, and where we talk to them, does it make sense for them to go on podcasts for their business? Is it their brick and mortar business? Maybe it doesn't make sense. They have an online, can they sell their product or service online? And really just, have that conversation with them to see whether it makes sense for them to be on podcasts, or they can just connect with me on LinkedIn. And that's just going to be my name. I believe it's Trevor J. Oldham. I believe someone else already had the name Trevor Oldham on there, so I had to throw that J in there, and they can connect with me and happy to chat about podcasting or entrepreneurship or business. Happy to really chat about anything. If you have any questions about starting your own podcast, getting booked on podcasts, obviously we offer that as a service, but I'm more than happy to just chat with you and share anything that I can to help your audience any way that I can.
That's awesome. And any book recommendations? I know you've probably read a ton of business books. If you had a few to recommend, what would they be?
Yeah, I really enjoyed Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson. Just goes into Steve Jobs' basically his whole background. That one is very fascinating. I like Outwitting the Devil by Napoleon Hill. Most people have heard of Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. That's usually a staple in the business community. I find Outwitting the Devil is honestly, I think it's a little bit better than Think and Grow Rich. And then probably the third one would be The Wealthy Gardener by John Saforic. That one's another excellent book. That's more kind of delves into real estate, but it does a lot about your mindset and different things like that. I mean, I try to read a book about every 2 to 3 weeks. So there's probably any number that I can recommend, but really those three have stood out over the test of time.
And 100% of your business is on performance, right? I mean, how many clients you have is what you make per month. I think,
Yeah.
that's how most businesses operate that are entrepreneurial is kind of you eat what you kill kind of attitude. So it's not like anyone's just gonna pay it. Like you gotta keep the work going. You gotta be able to hire great people. You have to be able to do all of that. What do you think has been your biggest challenge when it comes to that? Is it just because it's market dependent because a lot of your clients are real estate, or what's been the hardest part?
I think the hardest part was just finding good employees, honestly, or contractors, I should say. I mean, I would hire people that I thought were good, and the next thing you know, they're putting in their 2-week notice in 2 weeks after they hired them, after I've trained them and I just introduced them to a client. Now, how am I supposed to introduce them to a new client? So the aspect for me is I used to find a lot of these contractors on Upwork. Once I started finding them on Flex Jobs, I found the quality of folks were a lot better. I had to pay a lot more money. I don't know. I say a lot more money where Upwork, I believe I post for free, where Flex Jobs I would pay 200 or $300 or whatever for the month for the job posting. But that was really the hardest aspect was finding good people because at the end of the day, I don't want to be the one pitching the clients, booking the clients, talking to them, taking the sales calls. I've done all that. How can I put the systems and processes in place where if one day I want to sell the business, who could run the business? How can the business run smoothly without me there? And I know that it has to be a good team. And I would say on top of that, it's in instance when I'm starting early on, trying to be too cheap in the business, whether that was outsourcing to the Philippines, which I know sometimes companies can do it in any industry, but realizing I'd rather just have good quality US employees, pay them a good wage, make sure that they're taken care of, make sure that they, yeah, I think those are really the big things. They're really not more than that, honestly. I find a lot of people are just happy about the money, aspect of it, and also the job aspect of it too, more than anything else. But yeah, those are really the things that I had to learn was hiring a good team, and then I just want to have that trust. If I assign you a client, I don't want to have to worry about are you pitching the client, are you interacting with the client, because again, the worst thing that ever happens is a client comes to us, "Hey, I haven't never heard from so and so." Well, that's not great because our relationship isn't going to be going too good, and we're probably not going to be too long for each other. And I know that. And the hardest thing in a business is to get new clients, which is where it's nice when I get these reoccurring business where they pay us every single month. And then when we lose one, I take it almost personal. And I take it very personal when we lose it, when we should have kept that client where it was maybe we didn't do our job, which was something that was very simple ask from the client. That really, infuriates me. Where I don't the goal is to have a team of contractors where I don't have to worry about them, where they can handle these clients and do a good job for them.
And how do you not get bitter with that, right? Like, let's say you train I'm sure this happened a lot at first, like when you were learning how to recruit the right people. What did you put in place that ended up netting better quality contractors versus the ones that you didn't want? Is there something that you changed?
Yeah, I think it was really the interview process of it, where almost in the beginning, it was almost like I was selling myself on why they should work for my company. And then I switched it to making sure that they work, why they should work for my company. And I would have a set list of questions from 8 to 10 questions and treat it like a real interview process where early on I didn't really think of myself as a real company. And once I started to treat it like a real company and have these real interview processes, it became a lot better. And I found that I got better quality people. And sometimes I might early on, if I needed to hire for someone, I would have one call with them and then I would hire them. Now it's like I might have 10 conversations with 10 different people and maybe only one of them's good. And then I bring them on to our team, have them do a trial run. I have them work in the background for the month, see how they do. Have them almost like shadow one of our contractors that's been there longer, see how they mesh with them, get the contractor's opinion on it. So there's just more systems and processes put in place where now they're not, especially not client facing within 2 weeks because again, and even you hire the best people and you think they're going to do a good job and it doesn't work out. At the end of the day, you never know exactly how someone's going to work until you have them start working for you.
Yeah. And how do you not get bitter? Like, how did you not just throw your hands up and be like, I'm just going to do it all myself after you train people and they just immediately quit?
Yeah, no, it's definitely infuriating. I'm not gonna lie. You know, and it has come across my mind. Not recently, but it has come across where it's like, let me just fire everyone and let me just do it all on my own. And it's easy to get that thought, and then I'm like, okay, like I don't necessarily want to do that. And it happens sometimes where it comes up, but I think just knowing like, okay, like honestly, the big thing for me at the end of the day is I meditate every day. That's been very beneficial where I try not to be that stressed, knowing like, okay, like I've dealt with this before. I can go off and I can find someone on my own. I can handle the workload for the time being until I bring someone new. But yeah, no, honestly, it can definitely be stressful and irritating when you hire someone and they leave after 2 weeks, but I know that there's millions of people that'd be a great fit for our company and what we do and the flexibility. And we give them that. I'm gonna go on and I can fire or not fire. I can go on and hire someone else, and maybe they'll be even better. And that happened with my last hire where I had someone and they last like a month before they put in their notice, and then I have to backfill their role. And the new person that came on, they're like ten times better than the individual. And honestly, they're like one of our best contractors I've ever had in my business. And I'm like, well, ended up working out better this way. They're on top of it. They communicate with the client. They send their status reports. They send their monthly recaps. They do everything that I ask them. I never have to follow up with them or be on top of them or anything like that. So it ended up working out in the end. But yeah, it's just knowing like it's just part of business. No matter how good your interview process is, you're gonna hire people that aren't good and just have to brush it off. And yeah, it sucks, but go find someone else.
Yeah, that's great. That's great feedback. Well, I think this is great. And a lot of people are going to get great information from this just on podcasting, but also just in business in general. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do this with me, Trevor. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you.